Um, it's crazy times we have here, but we're making the best of it. So this is the first of a few different talks about the last few assignments that we're going to be doing in our class. And this talk is all about the idea of deep space. So obviously in making pictures, we often try to make an illusion of depth happen in our work. And that's a big goal of a lot of two-dimensional art is creating the illusion of three dimensions. And there are some simple tools that we have already been using plenty in our work. For example, uh, we have simple tools like overlap, right? Like if we're drawing something, oh, whoops, switch this. We're drawing something where we have two similar shapes and they're drawn in such a way that one appears to be behind the other. Pardon the quick, crappy drawing here. If one appears to be drawn in such a way where we don't think that one of these figures is like cut out and like stuck next to it, we assume that this figure here is in front of that. That's one version of three-dimensionality, which we would just call overlap, right? Overlap. The other trick that we obviously have at our disposal that's fairly obvious is we have two things that are the same kind of shape, and one of them is fairly large, and then the other is the same shape but small. Then we can suggest space that way. So that's through scale shift, right? So two different ways of implying three-dimensionality that are fairly straightforward by making things seem to overlap and making things seem to be shifting in scale. Two techniques. But of course we can get a lot more sophisticated than that, right? So we're going to learn some design strategies, that is drawing strategies, as well as color strategies for making a really powerful three-dimensional illusion happen. Okay, so let's talk about what that's all going to involve, and it's helpful to look back at a little bit of art history to do that. So let's look at this painting from the 1300s in Italy, Lorenzetti's Allegory of Good Government. And it's an old painting. It's painted on plaster. It's a fresco, so it's a little bit faded in certain ways, but you can still see it pretty well. And I would sort of submit that this is a painting where there's a sense of three-dimensionality for sure, right? Like a decent effort has been made on the angles of these buildings and things to make things look like they have some depth and some different three-dimensionality, different surfaces to them. We've got figures in the distance that look smaller than the close-up figures, right? That scale shift. And also, of course, things overlapping other things. So that would be overlap. But I would also argue that in a certain way, the space, while is suggested, gets a little weird here and there, right? And it might be a little hard to put one's finger on exactly, but I don't know, the angles of various things, I'm just not sure they quite match up in a consistent way. I'm not sure that figures are getting smaller as they go into the distance in a totally believable, consistent way. I'd also think that there's maybe some oddities of how the light is hitting things, like the way in this building it's light on the left and dark on the right, whereas over here it's lighter on the right and darker on the left. So a lot of nice sort of effort at making three-dimensionality, but not necessarily as believable as it could be. And I think that comes into focus when we look at another image like this one, which is Raphael's School of Athens from 100 and some years later. And it is a much more believable space, right? Like we really feel like we could almost walk into this world. And the architecture, the lines of the architecture seem to be kind of going backwards to a point in the distance. If any of us have any drawing experience, which I know some of us do, probably this idea of perspective is something that's already in your minds, right? So this idea of creating a space where you have a vanishing point, where the diagonals in your picture are leading you back toward a point in the distance. So we cite along these lines on the upper part here, also along the floor. We get a sense that they're all converging toward a point in the distance. So just like if you were walking down the hall in Boylan Hall, you would looked at the corners of the hallway where the walls meet the ceiling and the walls meet the floor, and they could seem to be leading you back toward a point in the distance. That is this idea of vanishing point perspective. And it is a very handy system to create an illusion of space. It's a system that we will use as part of our recipe for making a really believable, really satisfying three-dimensional space. We also notice other things too, that aside from just the design, if we think about the lighting in this piece, I think that we can tell that the light seems to be coming from the upper right hand, because the sort of right side, the upper and right side of things are getting hit by light most directly, and the left sides of things tend to be in more shadow. So that is also going to be a big part of how we create a believable space, is creating a consistent sense of where the light is coming from. And there's other things too about how the color is treated in things that are close versus things that are far that we'll get into. So we're going to have to spend a good bit of time and energy in this video and practicing on paper yourselves to kind of get a sense of how we use this perspective system. There's going to be a lot of color stuff to it too, but first we're going to need to talk over in depth how we create this perspective-based kind of a drawing where lines converge toward the distance. Here, I'll show you an example of a simple but very good version of the kind of piece we might be making here. So we have here, I hope you can see that there is a three-dimensionality to this piece. That it doesn't just look kind of 3D, but it really is pretty convincing, right? That we have a strong sense of space going deep into the distance, and a huge part of that is this perspective drawing, right? We've got these boxy shapes, but we notice that all that their diagonal edges are leading back to a point in the distance. That would be sort of somewhere right around here, right? And it seems to be consistent, pretty consistent, with all these angles, and that consistency, that all these diagonals are leading back toward a same vanishing point. It's that consistency that makes it work. If these are all going in different directions, then we would have something a little bit more jumbled feeling. We'd have something a little bit more like this, where these angles are kind of going in different directions that don't necessarily totally jibe with one another, right? But because these angles are using the single vanishing point, there's a unity to the space that really makes it quite believable. There are other things going on here aside from the perspective drawing that are making the space seem really satisfying. One thing we notice is it's got overlap, right? We've got things overlapping. We've got scale shift, right? We've got huge things and we've got tiny things. So that's part of the drawing strategy, and aside from just the perspective system, those choices of having huge things, tiny things, as well as things overlapping also help support the idea of this as a very deep three-dimensional space. There are other things going on too that have more to do with the color that are really making this illusion work well. There's a real difference between the way things in the distance are painted versus things that seem to be up close to the viewer. And there's, of course, things going on with how the light is hitting these objects. We'll get into that a little bit later in more depth, but it's just good to see a simple example here of the perspective drawing, and let's take a close look at how we create this perspective drawing. All right. So in the documents that I will have attached in the email and in Blackboard, you'll have this sheet here, which is sort of your cheat sheet for the steps of creating a perspective space. As it says here at the top, perspective is a system that allows you to create the illusion of deep space, invented during the Renaissance in Italy. Perspective is based on the idea that objects appear smaller as they move back in space and that lines converge toward vanishing points. So in one-point perspective, which is the system we're going to be focusing on for this, there are other systems that involve more points, but our approach for this piece is going to be a one-point perspective approach. We have a number of steps. So the first thing is, and as you practice this, you want to just take a spare sheet of paper, and you want to first make a horizon line that goes side to side, that goes across the middle of the picture. And I'm going to flip over to my other program here to sort of show that. I'm going to delete all of this. So if you have a sheet of paper, you're going to make a line that, let's see, should I do 2 point? Oh, okay. That goes straight across the picture. And this line does not need to be dead center. It could be slightly up or slightly down, but not too far up or too far down. You want it to be approximately across the middle of your picture. You also want it to be totally horizontal, right? That means parallel with the top and bottom of your picture, straight across. When you work with perspective, everything is with a ruler, and you make a careful effort to try to make things that should be parallel, truly parallel, right? Because as things get tippy and weird, you lose the system. The system kind of falls apart. So precision is important. Ruler straight lines are important, and just being generally kind of careful and sort of draw like an architect in this piece. All right, so we start with a horizon line. That's more or less along the middle. That's step one. And then as we saw over here, the horizon line, somewhere toward the middle of it, we have a vanishing point established. So I'll just mark this as a little X somewhere. Again, it doesn't have to be exactly in the middle, but somewhere in the middle-ish is good. You don't want it too far to the left or too far to the right. So a vanishing point somewhere toward the middle. Now, the next step is going to be creating just a rectangle. See, or some sort of a rectangular shape that is anywhere in the picture. This one's below the horizon line. It could be above. It could be overlapping the horizon line even. But let's start with one that's below, because that's kind of the simplest way to think about it. All right, so we're going to make a rectangular shape. Now I can of course make this lickety split here, no problem, because I'm doing this on the computer. But this is just a plain old rectangle. A plain old, the sides going straight up and down, the tops going straight side to side, parallel with the tops and bottoms and the sides of the picture, and these two lines parallel with the horizon line. A plain old 2D rectangle. Way to start. Then what we do, as it says on the guide sheet here, is create, and now it says here dotted lines. I made this sheet a while ago, and I've since decided that it's better not to do dotted lines, just to do a light line. So a light line connecting each of the corners of your rectangular shape to that vanishing point. Again, using a ruler, straight edges. So I'm going to do a light line here. I'm going to make it thinner than it was for these first lines. Pardon my jumpy cursor here. I've got a little glitch in my computer that I thought that I had fixed, but I guess I haven't. All right, so I'm going to connect the corners using a light line that's going to get partially erased later on. Connect my corners to the vanishing point with as much precision as I can. And that. And, oh, whoops, a little funny there. Hold on. Okay. So my corner's connected to the vanishing point. And so now what I have, and I haven't corrected this corner, right? That corner, because if this is an opaque object that not made of glass or anything, but made of something solid and that light doesn't go through, you wouldn't see the line coming from that corner back to the distance because it would be hidden, right? Hopefully that makes sense. So I've connected 3 of the corners to the vanishing point. So I basically now have an infinitely long box going all the way to the distance. So what I need to do is chop off that box somewhere toward the back of it so that my object isn't infinite but has an end to it. So what I do there is, as we see on our sheet, is we draw a line to the back edge of the cube. It says cube, but this isn't really a cube. It's a rectangular prism, but a boxy shape is what that means. Making sure they're parallel to the lines of the cube. So I go here, let's start on the top. So I'll make a line going across the top there, and it's joining the lines of the guidelines here, of those diagonal lines. And it goes, I didn't make it all the way to this edge there. Okay. So it's joining the top edges there. Now I know how deep my object is, right? It's going to end there. So I've done that. That line, now note this carefully. That line is exactly straight across. It's not angled or anything. It's just straight across parallel line. And it's parallel to the front line here too. And now we need to do the side, which is going to be the back edge that's kind of the sister of this front edge, right? And we know where it's got to go because we've drawn this line that lands us right here. So we know that line is going to go straight down from that spot. So I'll zoom in a little bit so that we can see it a little clearer. And I will go straight from there down to there, right? So now I've got the back edges established. So now I'm basically done with this object, right? I just need to erase some guidelines here, right? So I erase this line, erase this line, erase this line. And if you're drawing this in pencil, you might draw over, take another pass over these lines to solidify them a bit. So now we've got an object, and we've got a boxy shape that is not just a three-dimensional box, but where we really have a sense of it getting smaller as it goes into the distance, because these lines are all converging toward this vanishing point. So we have a sense of it getting smaller as this object moves away from us toward the horizon line, toward the vanishing point. Okay, so now we've drawn one object in one-point perspective going back into the distance. Now we want to add more objects. And again, as we add more objects, we use the same vanishing point for all the objects so that they all are part of a unified space. So I'll add one more here. I'll do it above the horizon line. I'll make a kind of different proportion. I'll make something kind of tall and skinny just to show that you can do any shape for these objects. So I've got a tall, narrow rectangle this time, but again a plain rectangle, straight parallel to the tops and bottoms, parallel to the top and bottoms of the picture and to the horizon line, and the sides of it parallel with the sides of the picture. Okay, so now I will make some thin guidelines going back toward the distance, right? Sorry, one second here. Let me get my thicker edges, and now I need a thin guideline thickness. Okay, so now I'm going to go to the vanishing point again. And as I aim to this, of course, I'm aiming to the dead center of that X, right? I mean, the X is a little imprecise, but I'm aiming toward the center of that X as I do all these lines. I connect the corners of the shape to the vanishing point. Okay. Now notice, as I did that, these two lines got really close to each other, right? These two bottom lines. And sometimes that makes people nervous. Don't let it make you nervous. That's appropriate. You follow the steps. This would get very skinny as it goes there because this is a narrow bottom of the object, and that's just how it works out. So that's totally fine. That's totally correct. There's nothing incorrect about it at all. So now I've got, again, an infinitely long rectangular shape going all the way into the distance, right? But I don't want it to be infinitely long. So I'm going to cut it off. So again, we just sort of establish the backs of the shape. I'm going to start this time on the side because it's a little easier, I think, than starting on the narrow part. And I'm going to make a line that cuts this off, connecting these two diagonals, right? So now this line back here is the sister of this line, right? There, it's the back side that corresponds with this front edge. Again, I've gone straight up and down no angle to it or anything, straight up and down, parallel with the fronts and with the sides of the picture. Okay, so now that I've got that line, I know where my bottom line has to go because it meets at this point, so it has to extend from that point. So I go straight across from there, sort of like that. And again, that's a very short line. It's not quite long enough, is it? It's a very short line, but that's fine. That's appropriate. That's exactly what it needs to do. So now I erase my guidelines. Oops. I erase my guidelines, my excess guidelines here. And again, if you were doing this in pencil, which I imagine you will be, you would, whoops, sorry, you would be, probably solidifying these lines a bit more. So now we've got two objects that are drawn in perspective. So what I'd like you to do is draw a number of these objects all together in the same space. Try different shapes of rectangles. Try rectangles that are, try volumes. That's why I call these, when they're finished, I call them volumes, right? Because the front of them is a rectangle, but the overall three-dimensional shape is a volume. Try volumes that are above the horizon line, below the horizon line, even overlapping the horizon line, because those work a little differently. And then, so try a few of those. And once you get really confident, you could try objects that are a little more complex. Like, what if you had an object that was like this, like where you had still boxy, still based on rectangles, but what if you had an object that was kind of like this, kind of getting into Tetris shapes or something, right? So how would you go about connecting these corners to the horizon line? It's a similar process. You create diagonals from each of those corners, and then you have to create a back that corresponds to the front. A little trickier, a little more intricate, but definitely doable once you master these plain old shapes. So yeah, that's our first step. On a scrap piece of paper, do a bunch of shapes that are working all toward the singular vanishing point to give yourself some practice. And then once you finish the drawing where you've just kind of done a practice round, I'd like you to send me a snapshot of that practice so that I can see if you're okay with the basic approach with the perspective. And then once you've sent it to me and I've kind of checked you off on it, then you'll be ready to watch the next video and get started on the actual assignment sheet. So this will end this first video on this assignment, but then once you've sent me your perspective drawings, your practice perspective drawings, then it'll be time to watch the second video, which goes in depth over the actual assignment that we're going to do that uses these techniques, but there's some more complexities to it, of course, too. All right, so thank you. Hope that was clear, and we'll talk again.